Hello and welcome to the detailed mock feedback for 13C. So if you are in 13C, this is the mock feedback that is relevant for your Purple Pen homework task. So the idea of this screencast is so that I can give some detailed feedback on the November mock that was completed on the 20th of November, and you can use your Purple Pens to go through and add and adapt your homework to then bring that work back into me, and I can see that some improvements have been made. Now, you know as well as I do that there's a lot to get through in terms of content, and I think it's valuable for you to have access to this kind of detailed mock feedback as well as what we do in lesson, so you can spend some in-depth time going through what could have been completed better. The first stage is to look at the numbers that I've put on your feedback sheet and pause the video at this point and write down what I've said is good about your work and what I've said is bad. Now, you will see on your mock feedback sheet that I've done this for each question. So for some people, they've done really brilliant things in one question but haven't done it in the other. So make sure that you pause the video at this point and then write down and make a note of your what went well and EBI comments. Pause now. Okay, so the first question that I'm going to deal with today is looking at outline and explain 2 reasons why women may be more likely than men to be diagnosed as mentally ill. So for the majority of you, this question was answered the best, and it involved looking at the different reasons that we've looked at for health inequalities in gender, but then taking it one step further and applying it directly to mental illness. Now, this is the content from the mark scheme that suggests different ways that you could make a point in relation to this question. Now, what's always the case in a mark scheme is you can always make a different point, but the examiner would need to know, and it would need to be really, really clear if you hadn't made a point that's on the mark scheme. So here we've got a selection of 7 points that could be spoken about. And at the bottom also are a list of sociologists that could also be included here. So Busfield was used well by a few of you here, and Mackenzie, the name wasn't used, but the ideas that Mackenzie puts forward was used. Now, we've got this idea that women have got more stressful lives, and lots of you drew on the triple shift and how women take on the burden of childcare, now going out to work and performing the role of taking on the emotional burden for their husbands and the rest of the family, and that's causing women to be more stressed. And we know that there's a connection between stress and further levels of mental illness such as anxiety and depression. So we can see that that's a good way to begin to talk about it by bringing in the ideas from Busfield that can establish why women might be more likely than men to be diagnosed as mentally ill. There's also a lot of research that's been done to include the ideas that doctors tend to associate mental illness more with women because of stereotypes or trends and patterns that they see in the medical industry, and therefore we see that if men and women went in with the same symptoms, men might be diagnosed with a physical condition, whereas women are more likely to be diagnosed with a mental condition. Also, we are very aware, and we've spoken about in all kinds of topics in the health module, that men are less likely to see a doctor, whether that's a threat that it's going to be to their hegemonic masculinity, or whether they've been socialised to not talk about their feelings. But because of that reason, they are less likely to be diagnosed for these issues because they're unlikely to get diagnosed in the first place. Women are much more likely to report symptoms because of their role in society. They tend to be at the doctor more, whether that's because of pregnancy and the reproductive system, menstrual pain, or whether it's to do with their children, and they take their children to the doctors, and therefore they're likely to be in more direct relationships and direct contact with medical professionals, so that might be contributing. Additionally, we see symptoms in men, as we've said before, being diagnosed as physical rather than mental, the idea that men kind of are invisible in relation to mental illness, and also that medical profession is patriarchal, and this is a feminist argument, of course, and we tend to see therefore that perhaps the medical profession would maybe put a label on women, perhaps to control them from the feminist perspective. And that's where we see these, why chefs Zaz and Foucault are coming in here, because they talk about the power of a label of mental illness and how that can be used to control and construct what it is to be normal and what it is to be abnormal. I'll be doing separate screencasts on the theories of chefs Zaz and Foucault to help our understanding and consolidate our knowledge there. But I think it's important that you can name drop in these answers, because it shows instantly to the examiner that you know what you're talking about. So here in the mark scheme, in order to get into the top band, you need to have very clear 2 reasons, but those reasons need to be different enough from each other. They suggested here that the relevant material and the relevant applications that could be used would perhaps be talking about certain mental illness that we tend to associate more with women, so eating disorders, specifically anorexia. Whilst this is increasing in the male population, we do see this is still a predominantly female condition. And again, bringing in this idea of the triple shift and the conflicting demands of women's role in society, particularly as now society has changed, and then there's the expectation that women will work, but also still are expected to be the nurturing, caring role, that's going to cause a problem. And the analysis is important here. So the AO3 mark, so it necessarily has to come from evaluation. And whilst I would encourage you to maybe put a line or 2 of evaluation in just to make sure, the analysis is using those phrases such as this means that, this shows that, and it's breaking down why those gender differences are causing the mental illnesses. So using those phrases to allow us to unpick what's going on here. Here's an example paragraph which can help you to identify how you could structure a point. So I'm going to move my mouse here to demonstrate what I'm talking about. So one reason why women might be diagnosed mentally ill is the triple shift. Okay, so I've used sociological content here, which shows knowledge and understanding. They've then brought in some relevant application of a sociologist. So Brown states that women have to undergo the triple shift, meaning that women are mothers, workers and wives. They unpick that a little bit further, and they make reference specifically to anxiety and depression, which shows that they're linking it to mental illness as opposed to illness in general. This goes on to elaborate a little bit more about women's role, and because they're looking after the children, they're likely to take them to the doctor. Now, what's good here is we can see that there's analysis because it's talking about the diagnosis, it's unpicking why that is a reason, and then it goes on here to provide a little bit of evaluation, which contributes to the AO3 mark, where saying that actually in society now we're not seeing this as much and things are changing. Mothers being the breadwinners more common in the UK. So if you'd like to add a paragraph that uses some of those ideas, you can pause the video now to support that. Now the next one, this is a tricky 10-mark question where we see you have to use ideas from the item. So it's asking you to analyse 2 ways in which the globalised health industry affects healthcare in the UK. In the item, it's quite broad. It's not as specific as sometimes the items can be. So we need to be very aware that we need to be careful in selecting quotes to show and shout and scream at the examiner, I have read the item, I have included the item. Now, differently to the previous question, they haven't provided any indicative content, but what we have got here is a selection of researchers. Now, when we're looking at globalised health industry, we're normally looking at drug companies and the exploitation that maybe comes about with drug companies, and also things like medical tourism. So the work of Lunt links to medical tourism. Goldacre and Law look deeply into this kind of big pharma context, and there's lots and lots of research of the World Health Organization and how much evidence that can provide as well, that we have touched on in lesson. So in order to get up to that top band, again, what we need to be seeing is this relevant material that's directly linked to the globalised health industry, not making sweeping remarks about Marxism necessarily or sweeping remarks about another perspective, but this is dealing with direct examples of how corporations are changing our health industry. So whether that's using examples of companies like GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer, whether that's looking at the power that those companies have over doctors and over the NHS, picking apart the fact that we're now seeing a huge increase in medicalisation and people kind of want a pill for every ill. All of these ideas are really, really important. And then in order to get up into that top mark, the analysis and evaluation needs to be of a high quality. So it does say here that you can provide either analysis or evaluation, but you need to make sure that it's linking back to the question. What does this say about the globalized health industry? What is this saying about how we can keep people healthy in the UK? So here is an example. Now this paragraph is dealing with medical tourism. So this student hasn't mentioned Lunt, but they have in detail picked apart what medical tourism is. And you can just see that by the amount of times they've mentioned medical tourism without kind of reading the paragraph in detail. So as you can see, they are suggesting that medical tourism is perhaps a positive of globalization and the global health industry because it allows people to jump the queues due to shorter waiting lists, and you can go to another country, receive quicker treatment. It's normally cheaper than if you were going for private healthcare within the UK. Some people say that this isn't quite a good thing because it, first of all, it doesn't challenge the problems that we've got in the NHS. It also means that doctors are becoming more like businessmen and they're taking their trade elsewhere and making a lot of money as opposed to being that altruistic doctor that the functionalists set out. Other things are that, there are only certain people that could be able to afford to do this, and that's the analysis, that's the evaluation that's important here. But this deals with, it's got links to the NHS, and we can see that it's definitely talking about globalisation, the global healthcare industry, and there's a lot of analysis in that middle section there. So please feel free to pause the video and have a read of that paragraph. Finally, this question was not very well answered. The other two, I think, were answered pretty well, considering that health is the topic from the first year and we're still getting back into the revision cycle. This question seemed to cause quite a bit of confusion, and there was a lot of writing about the social model without specifically applying it to the item or even the words in the question. So this talks to us about evaluate the view that health and illness are socially constructed. This isn't just an essay on the differences between the biomedical and the social model, and we did fall into that trap. Nearly everybody fell into that trap. It's basically asking you to talk about how is illness socially constructed, and you can do that by looking at health, you could do it by looking at the body, you could do it by looking at disability, and you could do it by comparing it to the biomedical model, which lots of you did, but basically lots of you used this to tell me how much you know about the biomedical model and everything that's wrong with it, which is odd because the question is asking you whether health and illness is socially constructed and what are the views for and against. So as we can see here, there are loads of ideas that the mark scheme recognises you could talk about, and lots of sociologists. We see Dubus and Pines, who I did teach you about the initial ideas about how, your health is going to be different based on your position in society, based on your gender, based on your age, based on your occupation, all of those kinds of things. We can look at the ideas of Foucault and how he believes that health and illness is socially constructed because those who have power have the ability to define what's normal and what's abnormal and how that can link to health. Blackster deals with some ideas about how age and disability can create our understandings of health. So what you need to do is go back through and look at these examples and see how these sociologists have an argument about something's being socially constructed. But if you see underneath where it says the indicative content, there is loads of stuff you can bring in here, stuff to do with the sick role. So Parsons deals with the sick role and talks about the idea that doctors are the gatekeepers in society. They decide who is sick and who isn't. So that's linking it to the biomedical model, but that does link to the social model. It's socially constructed. People with power decide whether you're healthy and whether you're not, which brings in some ideas of interactionism and labelling and the idea of master status and the self-fulfilling prophecy that are important. You can bring in the idea that there are certain illnesses that are stigmatised against, and that might suggest that actually society is creating this stigma. It's not something that's a biological fact. So you need to go back over all of your research from particularly the first topic that I taught you and apply it to all kinds of different areas. Now, in order to get into the top band here, it's quite general, the mark scheme, because the examiners expect that in a 20-mark question they're going to have a broad responses to this question, but there needs to be detailed knowledge. The concepts need to be well explained. Key terms need to be applied well. We need to actually understand what a social construction is, and by doing that you probably need to provide a definition. We need to see that the question is actually answered. So when it says appropriate material will be applied accurately with sensitivity to the question, you need to actually answer the question. An evaluation needs to be detailed and explicit, and again linked directly to the question. And so finally, here's a paragraph which deals with this quite well, which is looking at mainly how feminists argue that the body is, and the health is socially constructed, linking to the ideas of Lauber and Martin, and how they believe that, you know, health and illness is decided by powerful privileged men, which kind of translates into the images that we see in the media. It can lead on to women creating eating disorders, and also men. And there's a little bit of analysis here. It gives us some examples with Photoshop and things like that. And it makes it very clear that that's therefore what feminists believe, you know, shapes health.